Well, hello everyone. We continue with our medieval lectures. And as the medieval world began to wake up from its dark ages, it began to look back at the classical world. So what we have is the classical world that looked at natural appearances, while the medieval world will be looking back at the classical world. And by extension, early Renaissance will do the same thing until that begins to look at the natural world. And we are back to our old basilica, St. Peter's Basilica. And this basilica was built on the auspices of the Emperor Constantine. Under Constantine and his mother, a number of basilicas were built in the east and in the west. Well, he was dead by now, but the momentum was certainly going. And what we see here, and I mentioned it before, a Christian basilica looked back at the Roman basilica, which was in fact a civic building, not a religious building. Here, for instance, here we have a reconstruction of a Roman basilica and a Roman forum in London, as it may have looked like around the year 120 AD, when the Roman Empire was in fact at its height. The basilica, as I said, acted as a civic center, and it housed administrators, law courts, assembly hall, treasury, all sorts of civic buildings. So here's the basilica as we see it, and here is the Roman forum attached to it. The basilica constitutes one wall of the forum, and we see that it is a naval basilica with clerestory and with side aisles. Now, what we see happening in St. Peter is that the basilica now is turned 90 degrees towards the forum. The forum has now shrunk. It will become an atrium. And then in St. Peter's Basilica, more space was needed, so an extra building was attached at the end that will be known as a transept. And with time, the transept will move further west, right here, and will become a perpendicular arm of a nave, right here. And here we are. In Rome itself, that was more magnificent than, of course, in the provinces, like London at the time. Here, for instance, is a great forum of Trajan. This is the Basilica of Trajan, right here, Basilica Ulpia, with the forum. The temple itself was behind the basilica, right here. But the basic elements are all there. They're more magnificent because they're in Rome, but they are there. And the clerestory windows right here go back to Egypt, because the Egyptians in their temples needed extra light, and therefore the nave itself was raised above the side aisles, and the walls right above the side aisles were pierced with windows, which allowed light to come into the temple. And here we have the plan of the old St. Peter. Even though the basilica itself no longer exists, it existed for 1,000 years. However, in the early 16th century, it was finally deemed unsafe. Things were falling apart, and a completely new basilica that we have today was built. Well, it was unsafe, however, it was also filled with most spectacular mosaics and most beautiful art that unfortunately is now lost to us. But we do have the plan of this basilica. So here it is. There are the clerestory windows. Here are side aisles. It had 4 side aisles, 2 on each side, and a nave. The word nave comes from the Latin word for a ship. And the nave, the columns, led directly to the altar. The Christians found the Roman Basilica very convenient for their purposes because since it was an administrative building, it was a very large building for the most part. And the Romans needed a large building for their worship because while with classical temples, whether Greek or Roman, all services were conducted outside the temple and only priests went inside. This was not the case any longer. With Christianity, the entire congregation had to fit inside the church, and therefore they needed a very large building. The basilica fit the purpose perfectly. And here we have the old St. Peter again. Before, here we have a plan. Here we have a reconstruction, an artist's reconstruction of the actual building. The basilica itself here, the transept right there, and here is the old Roman forum, which now became an atrium, and with time it will become a cloister. When cloisters are built in addition to the atrium, the part of the atrium and the entrance into the basilica, which will be called a narthex, will be called paradise. And we are not certain where the baptistry was, so therefore two possibilities are presented here. The closest we can come to understanding what the old St. Peter looked like is the Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome, which was a contemporaneous building built in the early 5th century, which has very much survived. And here it is. We'll be looking at it more when we look at the mosaics in the building. But here it is. It's a central nave. Santa Maria Maggiore has one side aisle on each side. It is covered in most magnificent decorations, and at the end is an altar. After the 6th century, by this time the so-called barbarians who destroyed the Roman Empire had settled down. Dark ages pretty much ensued as we saw it, which really were stopped by Charlemagne and the Carolingian Renaissance that we had also looked at. And then after that we looked at the Ottonian Renaissance. In fact, Otto III, the Holy Roman Emperor, made Rome as his capital. But the year 1000 was looming, and the year 1000 was supposed to be the year of the apocalypse, the year of the Last Judgement, and as such population was horrified. So here we have it, the 5th, 6th century invasions. Then, thank God, Charlemagne stopped the downward spiral of culture. But then after Charlemagne, then there came 9th century invasions. At the end of the 9th century invasions, we had the Ottonian Renaissance. But within the Ottonian rule, there was the year 1000 and all the terrors that were associated with the year 1000. But then nothing happened. Within human memory of Christ's crucifixion, the early Christians were convinced that the second coming was imminent. Everybody was waiting for the second coming. But, well, it never came, and one had to adjust as best one could. But with the year 1000, then again humanity was convinced that now, with the passing of a millennium, the second coming was imminent. But again nothing happened. And again humanity began to adjust, but this time the adjustment was on a different scale. Because within a century, as we looked at it before, crusades happened also, and the Western knights, the Western populace went east. They saw a completely different life in Byzantium that, remember, did not perish in the 5th century. But also Islam by now had adopted itself to the lands that it conquered, and the lands used to be Greek lands, Roman lands, and Islam by now had developed a magnificent culture of their own, the golden age of Islam. So all these Westerners went east. They saw this very different life, completely different cultures, and while wishing to destroy it, they brought so much of its influences back to the West. And with that, trade began, trade between East and West. And as a result of trade, there was the evolution of trade guilds, especially in Italian towns, but not only in Italy, also in today's Belgium, the Netherlands, the Low Countries. The guilds slowly but surely began to assert themselves, and as a result of these guilds, a new merchant class began to rise, and as a corporation began to compete, in fact, with the feudal nobility. The rise of cities was very, very important, because cities slowly but surely began to acquire corporate charters that gave them independence. And as a result, there appeared a renewed interest in physical appearance, but also a renewed interest in getting around, in going places. Ultimately, the Middle Ages will prove to be rather mobile, and an excuse for this mobility was pilgrimages. Pilgrimages to places of relics. Relics became extremely important at the time. And of course, with so many people going east and none trained in medicine or anatomy, someone goes to a desert, finds a bone, brings the bone back, and this bone is sanctified by virtue of this man or woman going all the way to the eastern desert, Sinai Desert for instance, and coming back and having survived. Needless to say, that in itself was a miracle, and that miracle could only be attributed to the extraordinary powers of that particular bone. The bone was brought back, a cathedral was built on its side, the bone was surrounded with wonderful stories of miracles and stories of the life of saints. And then, before one knew it, pilgrimages began to that particular place, and people came, they brought money. It's tourism as we understand it. Tourism brings wealth, and in this case, this particular tourism was pilgrimages, and they brought a great deal of wealth. Now, Rome, needless to say, was a great center of pilgrimages, but, well, Palestine was far away. One did go, but that was harder. A great center of pilgrimage became Santiago de Compostela, right here in the northwest of Spain, where Saint James, Christ's brother, was said to have arrived on his cockle shell against the ocean's tide, right here, and once he arrived there, he died. A church was built on the place of his death, and then with time, a larger and a larger and still a larger church, and then it became a huge, beautiful cathedral. And this cathedral came to attract all sorts of pilgrims from everywhere. And particularly in France, there were 4 major routes. One originated in Paris, one in Vézelay, one in Le Puy, and one in Saint-Gilles-du-Gard. And anyone who wished to go on this pilgrimage from other parts, from London for instance, they would come to Paris and then take this route, and then from the eastern lands they would choose one of these routes from Italy. Here, of course, Then at the foot of the Pyrenees, all these roads came together around Roncesvalles and then continued together to Compostela. Well, when you have these rivers of humanity walking towards one direction, this humanity requires other places of worship to satisfy it. It also requires hostels, it requires eateries, it requires all sorts of accommodations for itself. And that's what happened after the year 1000. These beautiful churches were built everywhere. They were usually built on the foundations of possibly the former Roman temples or on the foundations of early churches. But now, with the increase in pilgrimages, they had to be bigger. So they were rebuilt. And as I said in the beginning of the lecture, while the Romans, the Greeks, while the classical world, classical age looked towards natural appearances, the medieval world now looked towards the classical world. And when they had to build larger churches, they looked at the Roman world. As a result, it's a misnomer, but this architectural form took the name of Romanesque. It is a pejorative term. The term was given to this short period because 11th and 12th centuries, well, in France 11th and half the 12th century. Romanesque, the suffix esque is a pejorative suffix, sort of Roman-like, not quite Roman. But as it turned out, it was a very interesting and very solid period in itself, but the misnomer held. For the longest time, the period of Carolingian Renaissance that we had looked at, and the Attonian churches as well, that kind of art, that architecture, that art was swept into under the same category of Romanesque until it was realized that no, both Carolingian, Attonian periods had their own very individual features, whereas the Romanesque, the pure Romanesque that we'll be looking at today, still differed, while of course looking back at it as well. So these are the four major roads. Now your text, actually it's a very comprehensive text and it follows every road. We will not be doing that. We'll be looking at several churches along the road, and you'll be able to find them, of course, in your text. Now, many of these were placed in extremely picturesque places. The church of Saint-Genis-de-Fontaine, for instance, at the foot of the Pyrenees, as you see, is just truly, truly lovely. And today hiking routes are established along the same trails as the pilgrimage to Santiago, and one in fact can win a cockleshell while walking on these trails. Here's what it looks like. It's in the mountains, it's overlooking spectacular countryside, and it was originally dedicated to both Saint Genesius and Saint Michael, and the church is recorded for the first time around the year 800, in the very beginning of the 9th century, before the new invasions. The Abbey church was most likely built at the same time as the original monastery. In the end of the 8th century. It was plundered and destroyed a number of times, not least in the 9th century with all the invasions, but then it was rebuilt around, around the year 1000, at the very end of the 10th century. And here we are looking at the entrance to the church. Here it is. Some of these things, of course, some of the elements are rebuilt, as you can see, but others are tremendously ancient. Here is the interior. It is a very simple interior at this point. It's all masonry. Later on, originally a wooden roof was constructed, but then with time, particularly into the 12th century when Gothic will appear and the pointed arch will appear, Many of these churches will be rebuilt again because there was so much lumber in them. There was the wooden roofs, for instance, that they went on fire. So at this point the vault is supported by these massive piers. It's just one nave, there are no side aisles, and the vault is supported by very, very thick walls. We'll talk about the construction of these churches, because that will be very, very important, since the holding up of the vaults requires enormous walls with enormous strength, because a stone vault pushes outward, and as a result these walls will have to be very, very thick, as you can see. And a number of these Romanesque churches that, especially in the south, that survived are extremely charming because they are still built with the old techniques, trial and error, and the best they could do was build very thick walls, as a result of which they could be quite dark, because by cutting windows in a wall, one weakens the wall, so that was not desirable. What is significant about this church, in addition to its extreme picturesqueness, is the entrance right here. This is the entrance to the Abbey, and is distinguished by possessing the oldest known Romanesque sculpture. And it's very simple, it's a lintel right here above the doorway. And of these sculptures, still the oldest in the church is that lintel, as I said. Here it is. You see how simple it is. It's just one doorway, one portal with the lintel. It's two posts and a lintel. And here it is. It's difficult to identify the influences, because of course there were a great many influences, not to mention that across the Pyrenees the Muslims still were very much masters of the Iberian Peninsula, and as I said, they had developed an extraordinary culture of their own that influenced the south of France significantly, and then the rest of Europe as well. But there are also Near Eastern influences and the Byzantine influences, but as a result of all these influences, all we have is this rather schematic lintel. We see Christ in the middle. He is presented in a sort of a figure 8 mandorla right here, and a mandorla, if you remember, it's a halo around the same figure, and by nature it becomes an almond shape, which also could allegorize Mary's womb. The medieval world was full of allegory. Everything meant something. And then he's surrounded by 6 figures that look sort of like Russian nesting dolls. Well, Russia was barely coming into existence at this point, so obviously no Russian influences. But here is Christ, there we have it, and this is the sort of numeral 8 here. He is very schematically presented. The mandorla is held by 2 angels with these enormous eyes, and on each side, as I said, in a sort of a horseshoe arch, under a horseshoe arch, and that obviously goes straight back to Islamic art. These are these nesting dolls. Now, while the design itself is very simplistic, very stylistic, if you remember our Hiberno-Saxon manuscripts and migration art and the interlace, if you look at the border, it is done with just superb magnificence and with ultimate skill. While figurative imagery was still very much at its inception, the decorative motifs were extremely accomplished. And here's our Christ. In his left hand he is holding the Bible, and with his right hand he is blessing us. And here you can see these figures. There is an interesting attempt at giving them individuality within this whole schematic conceptual approach. And each one of them is this, for instance, this one has a long beard, the two on each side are clean shaven, they have different hairstyles, beard here, very short beard here, clean shaven here, short hair there, long hair here. Whoever was carving it clearly was not just carving by a cookie cutter. A beautiful, beautiful church, another church along one of these pilgrimages routes is the Abbey Church of Sainte-Foy in Konk, right here, right there. So this is this road that began in Le Puy. Le Puy also, of course, has an abbey, and Konk is right there. They were monasteries, and each monastery had an abbey, and these monasteries, if you remember the plan of Charlemagne, they provided buildings, hostelries for visitors, and they provided refectories, dining halls for visitors. So they had a hostelry, essentially, and they became wealthier. The better the hostelry, the wealthier they became, because just as we tell each other, or well, today we look at the internet, which hotels provide better service, that's where we go. The mentality really did not differ much. So to Konk we go. Again, absolutely beautiful, stunning setting. And the attraction there was the reliquary of supposedly a young girl whose name came to be known as Saint Faith, Sainte-Foy. This reliquary comes from late 10th, early 11th century. It is about, it's about 2 feet tall. It is covered in gold, covered in precious stones, which is in itself ironic, because the girl herself was said to be a devotee, a great devotee of Jesus Christ, who embraced poverty, who wished to give her life to her Lord, and to have her imagery covered in gold and precious stones, as I said, quite ironic. Dresses covered with agates, amethyst, crystals, carnelians, emeralds, garnets, jade, onyx, opals, pearls, rubies, sapphires, topazes, antique cameos, what have you. Her face is thought to have originally been a face of a Roman statue of a child, which is very, very possible, because, as I said, many of these churches were in fact built on the sites of ancient Roman temples. And much of the architectural furniture, columns for instance, also were borrowed from the old Roman temples. So there was a lot of recycling going on. Yes, and here it is. The reuse of all the materials in new forms of art is known as spolia. And using spolia was not only practical, but it made the object more important by associating it with the past riches of the Roman Empire. And here we have our Sanford, and the church itself was built in the 11th century. Well, obviously it took a bit longer, and the construction or additions went on into the 12th century. And here you have it. We're looking at the apse right here with blind arcade. This is what it's called, the blind arcade, which is done for decoration. And it's very possible that it is inherited from Carolingian and Attonian art, as we had seen it. If you remember that architecture, it's almost as if we looked at children's cubes and the cubes were placed on top of one another. Well, much of Romanesque church building followed suit. Right here, these architectural forms are called buttresses, and these are projecting buttresses, so that the windows could still be cut out of the wall, but the wall is made stronger with this projecting masonry to make it stronger. And then The cross section between the apse, the choir here, and the nave is indicated by a beautiful tower, and then there were two more towers at the western entrance. Here is the inside of Sainte-Foy. Here is the nave. And as we can see, even from the outside, can we see it from here? Well, we can see it on the transept. The transept has a central nave of its own, plus side aisles, and that is what the main body of the church has as well. Now, these builders had a problem on their hand, because they needed to construct a large structure to accommodate all the pilgrims, and especially a central like Sainte-Foy would attract a great deal of pilgrims. At the same time, they needed light, so the walls had to accommodate windows. At the same time, building a wooden ceiling proved flammable, essentially, because these wooden ceilings would catch on fire and then the entire building would collapse. Even if it's stone, the stone would heat up so badly that the whole building would collapse. So they needed to vault it with masonry. They had lost the technique of concrete, so that wasn't an option. Masonry had to be put in use. And as I had mentioned, the vaults at this point were barrel vaults or tunnel vaults, and they were heavy, very, very heavy. And in order to accommodate those vaults, very, very thick walls had to be built. But then thick walls disallow windows to be cut through. So this incredible balance had to be reached between having a stone vault in the church, having the church large so that the vault would be larger, and the wider the nave, obviously, with the perfect arch, the larger the vault, and at the same time make it light so everybody could see their relics. And every church wished for more relics. They would have one major relic, for instance, but then if somebody brought another relic, an extra chapel would be built, so they became larger and larger. And today, something like Sainte-Foy, for instance, many of these churches have a lot more light than they originally had, because with the advent of Gothic architecture in the 12th century, and a better understanding of supports, the better buttresses were invented, flying buttresses. I mentioned flying buttresses when we talked about the Church of San Vitale in Ravenna, but we'll talk ad nauseum about them once we start talking about Gothic art. But with the advent of Gothic art and the invention of a flying buttress, these, in many cases, flying buttresses were added to these churches, and therefore larger windows could be cut. So this is very often what had happened. What we see here is a tunnel vault, a barrel vault, with the so-called transverse arches. It almost seems as if these arches are holding up the vault, but that's not the case. They are done for optical illusion, because as one walks into a church like that, the one purpose is to direct one towards the altar. So these compound piers will appear. A pier is just a masonry, a square masonry support, but when colonnettes are added to this pier, then this pier comes to be known as a compound pier. Also, its massiveness is not as apparent. Also, these piers often are splayed, and that too gives an impression of a lighter support. So it's these piers that are holding up the vault, and the transverse arches are being, they spring from the colonnettes that are attached to the compound piers. And as we walk into the church, all the everything, these piers act as soldiers that lead us towards the altar, and the same thing is done with the transverse arches. In the Middle Ages, soon enough, just as these constructions are happening, then theories too begin to appear, and ultimately the theory of beauty will, the criteria of beauty will consist of integrity, proportion, and clarity. So those three will be of utmost importance. And here the integrity of the building is shown here. The building is dedicated to Christian worship. Everything in the building leads one towards that Christian worship, with proportion as well. Every element in these churches serves some purpose, and clarity, and that is the clarity of purpose, is connected, of course, to integrity and proportion. And here is our church. This is the nave of the church. The apse is here. The choir continues after the transept. And these are the so-called radiating chapels. As I mentioned, Sainte-Foy is not the only saint, it's the most important saint. But then when other relics are acquired, it's wonderful to have more. The more you have, the more people come. And then these radiating chapels are built, and a very important feature of this architecture becomes an ambulatory. Ambulare in Latin is to walk, and here the side aisles, very logically, as I said, with integrity, proportion, and clarity, they then continue into an ambulatory around the apse, so that the crowds of people can easily walk around. They also have other distractions, so they don't all crowd at one particular altar, but in fact can look at other things as well. It's, well, think of going to a museum. Just to go to a museum to see one famous painting is one thing, and it would become quite awkward. So curators, of course, surround that one very famous painting with additional paintings of the same period, of the same master, or what have you, just so that the crowds who come to the museum can look at other things as well. Same idea, right here. So there is your small version of a pilgrimage church. Those are the churches that will be built during the Romanesque period. Another important feature is the entrance. We saw in the beginning of the lecture in the Abbey of St. Michael, we saw that very stylistic lintel above the entrance. Well, but this lintel also meant to convey something to people who enter the church. With time, these portals developed into just spectacular works of art. And this is how a Romanesque portal developed, and then Gothic cathedrals will acquire the same portals, stylistically different, but principally the same. In the middle, there would be two doors to allow for huger crowds, or just as with us, one walks in on the right and one walks out on the left, so that makes perfect sense. And then in the middle, the two would be divided by the so-called trumeau, right here. This is this, T-R-U-M-E-A-U, trumeau in the middle, which would be sculpted. And then the post, our post and lintel from St. Michael are still here. These are the bases, but then they're decorated with more features. More of those, they will be called jambs or half columns, are introduced, and then above the portal, as if a halo above the entrance into the cathedral, then are built the so-called arch vaults. They are arches in the shape of vaults, so they're called arch vaults. And then the resulting space here between the lowest arch vault and the lintel is called a timpano, and that too would be sculpted. Jambs would be sculpted everything would be sculpted. One would have a whole encyclopedia of biblical narration before walking into a church, because the church now was the house of God. And that concept, of course, was extremely ancient, back to Mesopotamia, back to Egypt. Temples were houses of God, except that in the Christian religion one could also walk into the house of God. But before one walks there, one should know where one puts his foot and behave accordingly. And all this decoration that will be seen on the portals will instruct one in pictures of what to expect. All the decoration, all the sculpture will be painted. So even if it is rather high up, one could still see it. So its impanum became a warning in stone. And in Sainte-Foy, the warning is the Last Judgement, right here. There are not too many gems, and the trumeau is not decorated, but the tympanum right here is. And as you see, the architecture appears to be rather fortress-like, and that, of course, remembering the times of invasions and remembering the times of destruction. Many of these structures were very, very powerfully built, also, of course, for holding the vault. And here is the Last Judgement. At first, it's very confusing, and a number of Romanesque tympana will be confusing because method was not yet introduced, and once a main idea was presented, then pretty much sculptors and cutters, master builders had their own ideas spilled out. But the main principle is that in the middle sits Christ during Last Judgement, right here, and on his right there will always be the righteous who are being resurrected, and on his left there will always be the damned at the bottom. He is usually on his own level. He is surrounded by various apostles here. Paradise on the right is represented by pedimented structures. In Paradise, on Christ's right, here the hand of God is beckoning Sainte-Foy right here, and then there's Abraham right there in the center. So let's see. There's Abraham in the center right here. There's God's hand, who is beckoning Sainte-Foy right here. And then under the arches, all of that is Paradise. Paradise is very architectural, very Romanesque. On the other hand, to the left, directly underneath Christ's feet, an enormous head right here. And this is the entrance into hell. And it opens to receive the dead. As the dead arise from their tombs, their souls will be weighed and they will be admitted into heaven or hell. In this case, this is very much hell. On the other side here, this is the wall that divides the righteous from the sinners. The sinners get thrown into this enormous open mouth, and the righteous have an archangel with a door flung open to receive them. So you see clear division between them. So as I said, and then while the angels, we see the angels on the right, we see various demons on the left. Very expressively done. The medieval world was full of superstition. The medieval world was full of apparition, because all the beliefs from earlier times, folk beliefs, that attached apparitions to forests, to rivers, all of that was still very, very much alive. And when these master craftsmen carved the images of hell, they carved their own apocalypses, they carved their own dreams, their own horrors. This was not a happy world. This was a dangerous world. This was, survival was difficult. They knew a lot more about horrors, in fact, than they knew about blessedness, then they knew about happiness. And as a result, the images of hell are always much more expressive than, obviously, than those of paradise. Images of hell, very often hell was there around them, and the monstrosities that one makes up in one's mind were all on those timpana. So these allegories, as someone said in the Middle Ages, it excited the spirit, it animated expression, and all of that appeared to the left of Christ in the scenes of damnation. And just imagine all of this is painted in all sorts of different colors. It would be extremely effective. Here's more of hell. In the middle sits the devil, and around him here's someone who is being hanged, other people being tortured, more people are being poked with all sorts of instruments. That's human imagination right there. Human imagination spilled out in the scenes of damnation, not in the scenes of paradise. Here, gluttonous man is hung by his legs right here, right there, and the cloth stripped from the wealthy. Here is somebody wealthy, and his cloth is being stripped and bitten into by this demon. And then here, very, very expressive, very clear once you really begin to look at things. And in times medieval, obviously people didn't live long, and as long as they did live, they did not have eyeglasses. Their vision was strong, their vision was trained at looking at the distance. And as I said, add to this bright colors, they could see what went on, and their eyes were not damaged by excessive reading. So all of this contributed to them, in fact, understanding what goes on this tympanum, even though to us it looks so confusing. Now, from Konk, we now go to Toulouse. All of that is very close. Toulouse is on this most southern pilgrimage route. And in Toulouse, we come to the Cathedral of Saint-Sernin. Now, this is a true developed pilgrimage church right here. And you can begin to read this church from the outside. Right here is the nave. It has 2 side aisles on each side, altogether 4 side aisles, 1 and 2. It has a transept with a side aisle on each side. The transept has 2 side aisles, and then here is our apse. Here is the ambulatory right here, and here are the radiating chapels. This is called the Westworks because the majority of cathedrals were oriented east-west, the majority of churches. East-west, the altar facing towards Jerusalem, and then the west is the entrance. And this is the narthex. When it was originally constructed, it probably also had an atrium, but well, today the city of Toulouse is a very large city, so it's all built up. This is the plan. Again, in the plan, integrity, proportion, clarity is all here. Here is the central nave. The nave has 2 side aisles on each side. The inner side aisle then becomes the ambulatory. Also, in the construction of these churches, the crossing of the transept and the nave often was taken as a central module. So here is the crossing, which is not quite square, right here, and then each bay in the church is half of this central crossing, is half of this module, and the same goes for the transept. So whatever the crossing is, very often on the engineering principle is taken as a module for dividing the rest of the church. The choir has 2 bays and then the apse. It's a very, very large church. It has 12 bays after the narthex, and then the transept could account for another 2, so that's 14, and another 2, 16 bays. Very large church right here, with the radiating chapels projecting from the transept towards the east, and also from the apse. And here's the interior. The nave, transept, and choir at Saint-Sernin are barrel vaulted, and the gallery right here supports the vault. The gallery is hidden right there under this roof. This is the gallery. So these windows essentially light the gallery itself. As we remember, in the original Christian basilica, what we had was the naval arcade, then a plain space that could be either covered in fresco or mosaic, and then clerestory windows. Now what is introduced in that space in between is the gallery, right here. And this gallery, this structure right here that acts sort of as a flying buttress, it also holds up the vault. The vault presses down, and then the gallery here, this is the gallery, it meets it. And as it meets the pressure, it assumes the pressure and then transfers it to the next structure right here and to the ground. And this is what happens. So the vault is now being held by the gallery, and then the gallery transfers its weight onto the piers and onto the outside structure. It is quite tall. This building is quite high. And as you see, there is this desire to build higher, to meet God midway, so to speak. But again, everything leads towards the altar. The first 2 stories of the crossing tower are Romanesque, and it's characterized by a perfect arch, and then the other stories are Gothic, which would be a pointed arch. It's a beautiful, beautiful tower. Here it is. And you see that the first 2 stories, well, the first story right here is just blind arcade, but still Romanesque. And then the last 2 stories and the steeple itself are a Gothic. And this is a transverse section of Saint-Sernin. This is actually a transverse section of a transept, because it has 2 side aisles. And you can see that this demonstrates to you how that vault is being held. This is the gallery, but around the gallery, as you see, there's all this masonry. And the pressure from the vault goes into here and then is distributed into the outside masonry, and of course held up also by the compound piers. And Saint-Sernin also has the compound piers, very large piers. The piers are so enormous, however, having these colonnettes attached to them and some splayed features makes them appear not as heavy. Now the barrel vault, I may have shown it before. Here it is. This is the barrel vault, and here is the thrust of the barrel vault. It springs, you hear, the vault springs from this point where the weight is caught by this masonry. In the future, this will be our flying buttress, as you will see. But this is where the pressure goes. Here it is, and this is where it needs to be supported. Otherwise, the walls will just fall apart. When 2 barrel vaults intersect, as you see here, we have a groin vault then, right here. And then, in addition to groins, ribs could be introduced. Right here, here's the transverse ribs. And then between the ribs, the web of masonry was built, the ribbed groin vault. The Gothic architecture will use this throughout, but already Romanesque architecture showed the way. And what happens then in this groin vault is that all the pressure now, instead of being distributed between walls, is now directed into these piers, and the piers have to be enormous in order to hold it up. But the positive, the good part is that the sides are open for air, open for ambulatories, open for light. And then a dome is an arch that's turned onto itself. And we saw this image before. Here's the arch, here's the tunnel vault that could be manipulated, and then the dome.